back to a better world. This is your host, Mitchell J. Rabin, and I'm very glad you're joining us again today. Today we're going to have an incredibly interesting show. We have invited back some colleagues and dear friends of mine, the Hurtaks, JJ and Desiree Hurtak, who are known as social scientists around the world. JJ is also the author of the Keys of Enoch, which has been a book that has been embraced world over. And their work also in very other domains is extraordinary. And we're going to be talking about something that you may have never thought of before, and that is water on Mars. And no, that's not enough. We're going to talk about water on the moon. And that's not enough. We're going to talk about water on Earth in places that you never thought to look. So, JJ and Desiree, so good to see you both.
Thank you, Mitchell. Thank you. We're so happy to be here.
So glad to have you.
And as you mentioned in your introduction, when I wrote the Keys of Enoch, I included pictures that I had from my colleagues at NASA. Here we see in the foreground 4 pyramids in the Elysium Quadrangle on the surface of Mars. This is a result of my remote viewing experiments, and then because of the accuracy, I had permission to actually get the actual pictures for the book. So the question is Mars hiding something very special? Were there environmental conditions of Mars that made it a planet of habitation or possible higher intelligence? The mythologies of Egypt, Africa, South America, and China speak of Mars as a planet of war. Was this due to volcanic disruptions on Mars, or was there some type of intelligence? We don't know all the details, but certainly we have fantastic new evidence that there was water on Mars.
Right, so actually just August 12th, 2024, there was an article written by the people working at Scripps Institute in San Diego. It's an oceanographic institute connected with the University of California, San Diego, that talked about amazing amounts of water, but not near the surface. Some 17 kilometers down. So it's like too far to be able to get with a drill in your backyard.
You need a very long straw.
Exactly. So, but nevertheless, they found so much water that they feel that if they had that on the surface of Mars, it would be 1 to 2 kilometers deep everywhere. And of course we know, and scientists have told us, of course, that back to like 3.2 billion years ago, what you see as all these lakes and things around Mars was full of water. That water actually ran on Mars. So they're saying around 3.2 billion, something happened. And they don't exactly know what. What's interesting is that the atmosphere is no longer there. So what happens if we wanted to go back to Mars, right? And, could we get it to rain? Could we get it to have the atmosphere that we do that produces the water and even has the oxygen in the local field? And the answer at this point is no. Unless they really started some other scenarios, like people talk about bioengineering, maybe putting certain types of certain plankton.
What is the story about gravitational fields on Mars?
Well, it's not really that.
Do we know anything about that?
It's mostly the magnetic field. There's something in the magnetic field, not so much the gravitational field, because that's pretty much has to do with the mass, but the magnetic field, the magnetosphere, that keeps everything like the ionosphere in place, all these structures
and moisture in the air, etc.
Exactly, that whole cycle you learned in high school.
Do we know anything about the gravitational field? Nonetheless, it has to have an effect on everything that's happening.
It's very slight. In fact, the Russians were going to examine this in one of their missions, but their mission to examine the magnetic and the gravitational forces was lost in 1989, called the Phobos 2, which was to look at the moon, but also to use very sophisticated remote sensing tools to penetrate the surface of Mars, looking at the gravitational field. So we're really in a new episode with the discovery that Desiree just announced.
Huge amount of water.
Actually, 20 years before, in a publication called Future History, I speak about the water on Mars and the need for new space legislation That is to say, if something that is as precious as water would be found, who would share the water rights? Again, we knew at that time, due to our physical test and also information connected with the Keys of Enoch, that Mars had been some sort of base for extrasolar intelligence coming in through our solar system, which is why so many ancient cultures
Extra-solar?
beyond our solar system,
Oh.
coming in and using it as a port of entry or using it as a base of discovery. And the Israeli scientist Chaim Eshed mentions that Mars is some sort of go-between between the cosmic intelligence of the greater universe and our planetary intelligence.
So are you suggesting then, JJ, that it was a base for extraterrestrial life, and that, no pun intended, evaporated at a
Very
certain
well
point?
said. Very well said. Absolutely.
I'm saying exactly what you just mentioned. So Mitchell, your observation is spot on. And an earlier work that I did with Russian test pilot Marina Popovich, whose husband was Pavel Popovich, the cosmonaut who had the longest time of endurance in outer space, said to me privately that when they sent the Phobos 2 mission to Mars in 1989, they were intercepted by a 16-mile-long spaceship that knocked out all of their technology, plus that of 9 other countries, over $1 billion. In fact, in an article I wrote called The Loss of the Sound from Mars, this is in one of the Spanish articles, I actually give you the picture that the Russians gave me of this elongated, lens-shaped craft that suddenly interfered, suggesting that there was already a base of some sort on our sister planet.
Right, so that image is the last scenes that Phobos 2 recorded. And what's really interesting with that is the fact that that was clearly not the Phobos 2 project. That was something else following the spacecraft right before it went dead. So in addition to that, I just want to say, so we do feel that there had been perhaps certain types of at least primitive life forms on Mars. But in actuality, if you don't have the magnetosphere, which keeps all this ionosphere and everything going with, we'll say, rain and oxygen, because it's almost all CO2 on Mars right now. So it's going to take a lot for us to be able to breathe that. It's less than 1%, it's actually 0.13% oxygen on Mars, when we're up in the 20s.
0.13?
Yeah,
Oh, really?
0.13. So there's like no oxygen.
That's going to be tough.
Yeah.
But remember this. When we first emerged from the water, oxygen, well, what does oxygen do? It oxidizes. And so it was very difficult on the first creatures that emerged from the water, because they were getting oxidized. And it took an adaptation, an evolutionary adaptation, to be able to metabolize oxygen. So too, it could happen with our metabolism of CO2. And plus, we are already very accustomed to CO2. We live in a sea of
Yeah, we're
CO2.
getting more and more of that.
Right, exactly. Not because we want, but because it is. But anyway, I just wanted to bring that up,
Very
some
good.
bearing, because it has some adaptive.
And the add-on
qualities
question
in it.
is, what happened to the oxygen on Mars? Who stole the atmosphere of Mars? This is a question that intrigued my colleagues
Sure.
at your propulsion lab.
Well, let me just say first, if there was life, the most logical thing would be something happened about 3.2 billion years ago where it would have gone underground. And I do believe there may even be, we may find bases underground, and at least especially life. And that's some of the things that the future probes are looking for, even if it's just microbial life.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting that about the same time, the moon supposedly had more water as well. And I want to just add also that Mars actually still has some water ice at the poles and in a few other places, but it's just not enough to
Yeah.
really have inhabitation with all of us if we had thousands of people.
But you know, if you think about what you're saying, Desiree, it's interesting, as I'm just thinking through as
Yeah.
you're speaking. If the magnetosphere is gone, then that might mean that the chemical transaction of CO2 to oxygen, or somewhere in that nexus, would disappear.
Right.
If the presence of the magnetosphere is there, then that exchange and increase of oxygen might remain.
Right, because
Does
it
that make
holds,
sense
yes,
to you?
it holds it in place. It creates this
Yeah,
ionosphere and
right.
other things that
Exactly.
literally hold the atmosphere. Right now, you can't really maintain an atmosphere on Mars. You also can't maintain an atmosphere on the Moon because something happened about 3 billion years ago that wiped
In both
it
places?
in both places.
3.2 billion?
Well, they're saying 3.2 on Mars, 3 on the Moon, but they're not really sure.
I
mean, this
remember
was
them
really-
well.
Yeah, I know. We're that old. but fortunately we have it. But now getting back to us, we're actually, the magnetosphere that's surrounding us is getting weaker. We've been noticing
Also.
that since the 1980s,
Sure.
and it's speeded up since the year 2000.
Especially in South America and Southern Africa, where people are having unusual psychic and paranormal activities.
I have a feeling there's a multi-dimensional aspect to it as well.
Where there could be a timing on all of this. There's something called transcranial magnetic therapy. And what that is, when people are depressed, they can go, and this is happening all over the U.S., and it's approved, that you go and you get this magnetic field by your head, and actually your neurons start activating. So this, I think, is happening when now these solar flares, and I know you're very much into the solar flares, are bombarding our magnetosphere. We talked to NASA scientists and said, oh, well, the magnetosphere protects us and everything just goes around the Earth. Well, now that we're in the midst of solar cycle 25, it's not quite like that because actually they're starting to feel and see that the X-class flares are actually penetrating even into our oceans.
And the top NASA scientist we talked to, we will not mention his name, but he said 2025 may see the going down of the energy grids in Northeast United States or of Europe. The grids would have to be replaced, rebuilt. This would take time and effort, and only China is prepared with the resources to do this. So there could be massive blackouts, social disruptions, and a change of lifestyle that hasn't happened for essentially for hundreds of years.
Well, you know that I've been working on a project out not far from you out in California, which is a remedy to the grid going down. We have a
Exactly.
way of people having their own power source.
And a better world will require such technology.
There you go.
So we see on Mars the environmental situation that either if there was life, perhaps it was using technology was used the wrong way, or possibly a comet came by Mars and stole the atmosphere. We're not certain, but Mars is an example of the book we wrote years ago called The Face of Mars. We're republishing it because we have in the back of this book the Russian experiments using laser beams and remote sensing technology to go under the ground, and not as deep as we now know are their water resources, but exactly matching what we will call surface water reserves and the great ocean bodies of water that exist on Mars as an illustration of what we must do with environmental conditions here on home.
Right, so scientists are now looking at the water that's actually under this far down on Mars may not have related to the fact that there was water also from the surface. It actually made two separate things. And we now know, and this was just also recently discovered, that we have huge amounts of water, but 700 kilometers down, literally where the mantle pretty much goes into this transition zone close to the core.
I want to tell you a story.
Okay.
I was out in Santa Barbara at a Sacred Water conference in around 2003-4. And I was videotaping and interviewing people left, right, and sideways, including Dr. Batman Gelich, who wrote The Body's Many Cries for Water, Oren Lyons, who was one of the speakers.
Yeah.
And I also met a dowser, lovely older man, who said what you're saying right here,
There's
Desiree.
water down
He
there.
said there's plenty of water, there's no shortage of water on this planet, you just don't know where to look for it.
Yeah.
He said, but with my dowsing sticks, I know it's there. So anyway, I just want to say this as a point of corroboration and confirmation of these currently scientifically deduced statements.
Well, absolutely.
It's kind of interesting.
So
right?
they're trying to figure out if these plants were actually created from almost like a water substance, because why are they so far deep, especially in ours? I mean, it almost seems like it's too far to go from the surface to the lower area. Maybe there was something in the formation of the planet that brought the water levels to those depths in the inner mantle area. But now one of the other things that we're talking about.
It's striking, though, that it has taken this long for that discovery, with all of the geologists and all of the seismic equipment that we have, that it would take until 2024 to make that discovery.
Well, what happened for Mars was there was a project called InSight Lander, which was a NASA project,
Right.
and it was launched in 2018, and it landed on the surface of Mars. Now, one of the things it is able to do is it has a seismograph. And so it sends these signals, and it's a pretty strong seismograph, obviously, because they were trying to figure out how deep is the crust, how deep is the mantle, what's the core about. And I have to say, in sadness to all those people who think of the hollow earth theory, most of people have seen that, most scientists have seen that the core is solid, that is probably even metallic. So we believe that people think that people live underneath the ground, that it's not the center of any of these planets, but it's under the ground of these planets. And we have,
So in other words, it's not so deep,
Right.
but it's there somewhere along the pathway
Right.
to the core.
and maybe even now,
Yeah.
ours is getting weaker. The planet itself is actually shifting quite a bit in terms of its rotation and its frequencies and everything like that. And so when you actually get these solar flares that people are now afraid of, some of it actually could be good, because we feel it's shifting the magnetic field enough to allow people to kind of tap into higher realities, kind of breaking through the doorway. It's opening the threshold.
Opening the veils
Yeah.
is
and-
one of the ideas. They also said that about the ozone layer and the Van Allen belt.
Well, the
many,
Van
many
Allen is
decades ago.
But I want to go back for a minute to talk about the effect of the planet, literally, and the magnetosphere on our consciousness, because I think
Yes.
that's important for
I
people.
really am glad you're saying that, because what JJ was saying before about in South America and Africa and elsewhere, there has been reported these psychic openings and downloads, as if we're
Right.
use.
So there's something called the
Something's happening.
There's something called the South Atlantic Anomaly. It stems from southern Africa, and it goes all the way across, mostly to Brazil and also Chile. It's growing, and what it is actually a depletion of the magnetic field strength in these areas. But I know you recently, and you do like to go to Brazil. You've been there, I think.
No,
Oh,
not
you haven't?
Brazil.
Okay.
Peru. I've been in Brazil and the Amazon.
Okay, well,
But
that's
you can't
still
tell the
qualified.
difference where the border is.
Well, but bottom line on all that is that I feel people are actually quite spiritual and spiritualistic, if one wanted to say,
Yes.
in the area of Brazil and these South American
Yes.
countries. I think some of that has to do with the weakening field that exists there. So right now, they have almost no magnetic field strength over their heads. So that's not good for solar flares, but it is good for consciousness. And we had friends doing some research in Russia, actually, with consciounsess, where they had this whole type of mirror, and they shifted the magnetic field and put a person inside it. And you can tell with a weakening magnetic field, consciousness actually expanded. Now, I have to say one other thing, and that is when people who are not prepared and not seeking higher consciousness get involved in these shifts of the magnetic field, it can somewhat be chaotic. And I think that's happening a little bit on this planet, where people are feeling the power of chaos in their lives. That's because this is part of what's taking place through the magnetic field shifting on the
Well,
planet.
I think one of the issues that we are dealing with, confronting as human beings, is our ability to remain coherent in the face of chaos. And people aren't given the training, nor have the discipline, even when they get the training, to actually stay centered. But I feel grateful myself personally, because I had exposure to practices going back to early teenagehood, with yoga and then Tai Chi Chuan and Qigong and different types of meditation that always accented the importance of coherence. And then the Heart Math Institute brought forward the idea of heart coherence. And when you get mental and heart coherence combined, you have one coherent being. And when people are holding that field, they will not get caught up in the chaotic miasm, if you will, that is surrounding us.
One of our NGOs is in Brazil working with the indigenous. We are honorary members of the Xavante Nation, which is in the Mato Grosso area. And they said, put light around the body think positive. We would say fasten your seatbelts because we're going to go into some climatic disruptions, but does not mean the end of life as we know it. Mars and the evidence of a lost civilization, to me, bears a higher message for us. The face on Mars is what we call in psychology a Rorschach ink block geometry of what we see in ourselves, being able to pioneer space, to go into outer space,
Sure.
to learn from our cosmic neighbors the technology, but also the psychology we need to be better humans, understanding positive work.
I mean, let's think that that's really what this game is about.
Yeah.
Right.
It's about becoming better humans, which means actually fulfilling our human potential, which is essentially cosmic potential.
And I always like the fact
Do you
that,
think that's a fair thing to say?
well, yes, but we are on planet Earth and we're surrounded on one side with Mars, which is known as the planet of war for whatever reason. Maybe it was just really more a planet for destruction. And what's on the other side? Venus, the planet of love. So I actually think it's really showing that we're in the midst of this duality, and our choices, our decision making at this time is critical for the planet. And that hopefully this higher information that shows us the direction we need to go and how we can share better together is what's going to be critical for our lives.
I'll tell you, the relevance of what it was I was just saying about maintaining center and ground and coherence is that in the midst of chaos, when we're being pulled, you could say, by the planetary forces of war, when one remains centered, they don't have to just oblige. One can hold the center and the sense of values they have and not be pulled magnetically into war. And people lose their sense of humanity, which is a cosmic phenomenon when we don't think of it that way, but it is that. And we really have a chance to step out of the madness of the context that you've outlined, and I think it's
And
really
so
interesting.
we're beginning really at this point with solar cycle 25, just happens to be
And what exactly will that implicate for us?
Well,
What
that
does
means that the sun system itself has solar minimums where there's less
Right,
flares
and
Every 11
and
years
solar
plus.
maximums. And so since they've been counting, it's about every 11 years, as Dr. Hurtak said, we're going into the 25th one that they've been measuring. So it happens to be about 2025. Some people say it's so strong right now that it could be 2024 because they don't exactly know the maximum until you're on the other end of it, so to speak. But they are targeting
I see,
2025. So we will be getting more solar storms. We will getting X-class flares and borealises, and many people, we've been, in fact, I'll show a few pictures here, that we've been to Finland and our friends have shot the beautiful aurora borealises that you see, and some of it is even coming further south. So this is all affecting not only, we'll say, the planet and maybe a little danger to some of the satellites flying around, but I believe it really can affect our mental understanding of how we're functioning, our balance in our own consciousness field. And so that's why all of us have to be, for a better world, to be centered, exactly what you're saying.
And I would like to add a footnote.
Beautifully put, Desiree.
As the Keys of Enoch mentioned, the pyramids on Mars is part of the larger blueprint. We have found in our research cultures throughout the world, including the Mayan and those in various parts of the Orient and Middle East, all have these pyramids. You will see the geometry of light as a result of experimentation we did with sound waves, mantrams, that the pyramids seem to indicate the basic geometry of evolution. So it was not surprising we would find this on
So
Mars,
interesting.
a connection between Mars and what the Egyptians call in Arabic, them speaking of the present generation, Al-Kahira, or Mars, the spacious one. So why should the Great Pyramid and all of the other pyramids of the Giza Plateau have this mythology of Mars unless there was a connection at one time? So we can fasten our seatbelts, but also open our great imagination of realizing that we are very close to a cosmic drama. And we can use Mars as a stepping stone for cooperation amongst the seafaring nations and the spacefaring nations. We must educate people not to be afraid of the future. Educate people to understand the great heritages of the past that had Mars. In fact, even in the New Testament, we're told the Apostle Paul lectured to scientists and philosophers on Mars Hill. So that might be an oblique reference to the fact that Mars Hill in the Greek civilization was recognized as a place where philosophers were looking. It means that we must connect past, present with future. But it must be a better world, it must be a better universe, it must be a better human. That's why we're together.
That's
Mitchell,
for
we thank
sure.
you for this great opportunity to share.
It's my pleasure. I am honored to hear and sit with you both again and to educate this audience about this incredibly powerful material. And it's mind expanding just to listen to the two of you share what your actual experience is about and research.
Well, thank you.
So thank you.
Actually, I'm still looking forward for civilization from Earth to go live on Mars.
And it's
Mars.
interesting, Elon Musk, in spite of his ups and downs, felt that his final resting place would be on Mars. So this is suggesting that there's knowledge, shall we say, on upper management levels, that Mars is a place of exploration, a place of exo-industrialization, but as we indicate in our writings, exo-sociology, where we will learn to be better humans by learning how to be connected with the planetary sister.
And if it goes closer to us and then farther away, at its closest point, it will only take 9 months, which is what it takes to have a kid, to get to Mars. And so I'm looking forward to that. But something happened to it. I think we still have a bright future, so I'm not worried about the planet here, but we do have to keep ourselves balanced, centered, to have a better world.
30 minutes
like
for a
that.
voice signal from Mars to Jet Propulsion Lab. 30 minutes.
Well, I'll tell you, I'd rather our extraterrestrial brothers and sisters come here to visit. But anyway, everybody gets their own. Anyway, I want to thank you both again for being on A Better World again and sharing your wisdom and intelligence. And
Well, you thank you, Mitchell, also
thoughtfulness.
for the great work you've
So-
done and continue to do to show that we have positive alternatives. New technology, new water technology, new technology for other energy sources, using our oceans for food research, for food exploration. The whole dynamism of life in the universe inspires within us a whole new credo or creed. So let's get down to business. Let's
do it.
recognize the heart guides us in all that we talk about.
Indeed. Well, again, this is Mitchell J. Rabin for A Better World. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did, and you feel more grounded and cosmic at the same time. Thanks again for joining, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.